a great hunter. Illiganuk is part of my father's roots. He single-handedly got a bowhead whale with a kayak. So he had the village put up the skull of the whale on land.
There was a tough Eskimo, but he kind of abused his powers a little bit. There used to be a sea monster by Gearing. People, when they used to travel with skin boats, they used to have to go portage over a certain point. Because if they tried to go around the point this way, that monster would come up and wipe out the skin boat. But this guy, he was so tough. He said he's going to go kill the monster, so he went with his kayak, you know. Sure enough, he went around the point and then the monster come up, but this guy killed that monster. But he was abusing his powers. So these village people say, we gotta get rid of this guy. So when he come from some place with his kayak, those guys planned they're gonna go bring him all their furs. And he was still sitting inside his kayak, you know. So they start stuffing. They stuffed him so good he couldn't get out. And then that's when they start harpooning him. This guy's mother was so mad. She said, you guys killed my son and I'm gonna punish you guys. She filled her mitten with sand and let it float away. And those guys say, this used to be real deep. Somehow that mitten filled this whole bay up with sand. No more deep water, no more whale hunting.
The site's about 1,000 years old.
Of all the sites in northwest Alaska, it offers some of the best potential for discovery.
The focus of the project is really this small site that's behind me. We call it the Rising Whale site because it has kind of a shape of a rising whale.
What struck me about the site was its profile on the horizon. It really looked like a whale coming out of the marsh. So that was kind of the origin eventually of the name.
There was a realization that the site, the Rising Whale site, was a very special site because it was an early site which probably had what we call Burnick component in the typology of cultural moments in Inuit prehistory. Very similar in shape and in context to the Burnick type site near Barrow in northern Alaska. I worked directly with Owen Mason. Owen knows this place here extremely well. He's worked in northwestern Alaska for over 30 years.
Nice to get a picture of it, the sign in there. I just happened to be looking at the photos and I noticed this particular site here. And I said, man, there are a lot of house depressions over here. And they seem to be in a really critical place in the sequence that we think of as northwest Alaska prehistory. Got a radiocarbon date that was in the range of 1,000 years ago. And since that seemed to be earlier than what we knew about this ridge, I said, wow, maybe there's something here, something that we'll be putting the pieces together. Because we knew there was, a big gap in the occupations. You don't have anything for centuries. Cape Esberg was really not a hot spot, if you will. Then about AD 600, there's a little occupation over there of a very interesting group that's widespread across northwest Alaska and really well known from Point Hope. And that really inspired us when we saw the extent of the houses. And that was the first time there was a sense of how many people could have lived here in any one of those villages. You get the numbers of house depressions and cache pits and the whalebone that we saw on the surface. Started thinking this was probably a lot more important place than had really previously been thought about. It's just so rich in material of all kinds. So we didn't anticipate those things in the beginning, but because of what we found in 2011, both in the harpoon head technology, some of it which is identical to Cape Baranof, 1,000 miles or more away from here on the Siberian coast, harpoon heads and styles that resembled St. Lawrence Island. And the metal, the ties to Barrow. The first evidence of Umiak, that the obsidian we found in 2011, that also had Siberian ties. So we're even more like, hey, this is really getting to be a story here.
Before the project investigators or the PIs applied for funding, they called to talk to the park about what it is they wanted to do. And then I talked to them about going to Shishmaref, Deering, and Kotzebue to talk to the tribe and also the communities about what it is they wanted to do. Because this project and many others have a very close tie to the indigenous people of the area. So it's important not only to get their permission and concurrence, but also to set them up with the right people that they need to talk to.
So then Owen and I had a meeting in Shishmaref to present the project, and we obtained a plan of action and a memorandum of agreement, parameters under which we can work and under which we excavate. During the consultation with Kotzebue, Deering, and Shishmaref, what came up was the people we had to directly consult with were the descendants of the families who had ancestral ties with the Cape. And that's how Fred Goodhope actually became one of the spokespersons for those families.
This flat used to be a lake, used to be further out. That's how much it's been eroding, I guess.
Yeah.
My parents were Fred Goodhope Sr., he's from the local area. And my mother, May Barr, was her maiden name. The Barrs grew up in Espenberg. They called it Inuinnaq. Our family mainly lived here in Espenberg area and Deering, Alaska.
Maybe the Rising Whale site was showing that people arriving into an area rather than already well settled here. In terms of the material types, type of objects, and architectural details that are much different than what comes later. So that's one of the questions that we have in the project, is to understand who these people are, where they're coming from, what their social networks were, whether they were more connected to Chukotka. The obsidian seems to be coming from Chukotka. They're not using the jade yet from the Kobuk area. There's some harpoon heads that are very similar to things, to harpoon heads that are found both in northern Chukotka and in Point Barrow. So there is this connection with further away areas that we're trying to understand. Dennis O'Rourke specializes in ancient DNA and has been key to our project.
We know so little genetically about the Bernurk people, so it seemed an opportunity to learn about the genetics of an early people that we know comparatively little about. There was remains of one individual found in one of the houses that was being excavated, and it was through lengthy discussions and agreements with Shishmaref, which is the closest community, and the Park Service, to take a small sample back to my lab for analysis, see if we can't get a clearer picture. I think many archaeologists would view the Bernurk as ancestral to the Thule. They lived a bit earlier, and their cultures are fairly similar. They share some characteristics. Maybe the Bernurk are the forebearers of the Thule, and we're interested in seeing if our genetic studies would be consistent with that.
Bering Land Bridge Preserve is largely set aside because of scientific reasons. Bering Land Bridge itself laid out a framework as to why Bering Land Bridge was a critical resource.
It's important to understand the landscape and try to reconstruct where the shore was at the time the site was occupied. We know that all this land that is in front of us was not there. It got built later. When the Rising Well site was occupied, the question is how big was the ridge we're sitting on right now and where the water was in front of us and behind us. And so that's the job of Nancy Bigelow, Chris Mayo, and their student this year, Bogardus.
We're actually at the very northeasterly tip of the Seward Peninsula. Right here, this is Cape Espenberg Light. 1,000 years ago when people lived here, how close were they to the ocean and what types of things that were occurring might drive them to maybe change their hunting patterns and subsistence patterns. This location right here is about 2 or 3 beach ridges back from the ocean, and yet we have access to a protected lagoon over here where they could have brought in their kayaks, and we have the sea out here which they can keep an eye on other resources that might be coming by, such as seals or whales. So here we are today with a pretty strong 30 to 40 knot easterly wind. They must have experienced a lot of these types of storms. The people that lived here approximately 1,000 years ago, their descendants are still living today in places like Shishmaref and Deering. They've been through climate changes, they've been through sea level fluctuations, incredibly huge storms, so they can teach us a lot about how to adapt to some of the changes we experience. We're standing on what we call a beach ridge, and these beach ridges are originally formed right up near the ocean where storms will deposit material that then get built up due to wind-blown sand. This beach is actually growing seaward. So as you move seaward, the archaeological sites get younger and younger. And so if we walk to the barrier maybe a couple miles back, we're going to have sites that are 4,000 or 5,000 years. When we're up this way, the sites are more like 500 years.
So it seems like in Northwest Alaska, it was a little more like it is now, a bit of climate chaos. When you're used to one type of climate in your life, and all of a sudden things are totally different, this place allows us to see how people are responding to climate fluctuations that they could see in their lifetime. You know, within 10, 20 years, they were seeing totally different weather conditions.
That lake was deep all the way along the edges. You could see where the edges was. Now all that water drains underground and goes out to the river. That's happening all along the coast to big lakes. They're all draining. No more permafrost. We used to do a lot of seal hunting, uguk hunting, you know, for dried meat and seal oil out here. But where our drying racks used to be, the whole river started moving this way and washed away where our drying racks were.
It's been many, many years since I've been here. Good Hope used to have a house right over there, but this is the one that they would live when they come here. Fred and Fanny Good Hope. But it's sure eroded, used to be further down.
Chris and Nancy have been able to really get some amazing data combining their forces. Nancy Bigelow, she's a paleoecologist, and so she's doing the vegetation reconstruction and climate history.
So we're down in a swale. We're barely above sea level here. Plants are growing on here now, so at some point this was below sea level, so that's why we're going after the bottom of the peat. If we can get a date on that, that tells us when this ocean moved away.
So here's the surface right here, so you can still actually see the plants right here. So that's just this stuff. And then we have a layer of peat. And what we're really looking for is the transition between the peat and the sand. And so that's basically when the sea levels were far enough out that the freshwater peat, like we're standing on, was able to be established and start growing. So it's a sea level indicator. The transition from the shells, and then goes into the more finer sand, and then we have a transition to peat, so it's nice layers. We collect a lot of data at each core site, so this is a salinity meter. Mostly it's been just fresh water, 0.34 parts per thousand, so it's fresh water. Out in the lagoon there, it's around 23 or 24, and out in the ocean, it's more like around 30. That just kind of verifies that this is a freshwater marsh here.
The vegetation between the swales and ridges is very different. In the swales, you're getting plants that like being wet, so you're getting a lot of sedges and grasses. Particularly the sedges are often used by people to either line the entryway of their houses, or there's ethnographic data of people using sedge to line their boots. One of the other possible attractants to living on the Cape here is that this area has many berries. There's the crowberries here, which are very prolific. Low bush cranberries, salmon berries or cloudberries. There's bearberries, blueberries as well. In the fall, this is a perfect place for berry picking. And we certainly found plenty of berry seeds. And we do have a few shrubs here in the swale, willow shrubs, and they're all really low. So for wood, people were using driftwood. There's lots of big pieces of wood, and they clearly did not ever grow here.
The Cape is an unlikely place in wood. I mean, there's not a lot of wood right now. So the fact that we have a ton of wood in there, and every day it gets increasingly more.
The amount of wood and the size of the logs that are found in the house that we're excavating is pretty incredible. An indication that there wasn't that many people on the landscape, or that the supply of driftwood was so actively renewed, because it seems that there's a large amount of wood that has been used for this house, and you don't see that today on the landscape and on the beach. The tree-ring analysis of the driftwood shows that about 2/3 of the wood is coming from the Yukon River, from as far as Fort Yukon area, Yukon Flats. Some of it is also coming from the Kobuk-Noatak River. We're working with Lauren Norman. She's the zoo archaeologist on the project and a crew chief. So she's extremely skilled at managing people, actually.
I'm Lauren Norman. I am the crew chief. So as crew chief, I do the logistics of where crew's going. I keep track of what they're doing, keep track of the finds that are coming out of the ground.
Are you in the southwest?
I'm also the keeper of the radio. Hi, Suzanne. This is Lauren. Over.
Hey, Owen's just about to head out. Do you all need anything?
I have input on where we should be digging, kind of in a general sense, and then where Claire needs to map, where Owen needs to do stratigraphic profiles, and where people need to have 1 or 2 people working on certain units. Today we've kind of finishing up in the Western Block, which we originally opened in 2011, continued working in 2016, and now are finishing up there. And people will be moving over into this Eastern Block, which is a newly opened this year set of squares. Juliet is currently working in there. We're removing the first layer of roof fall. Claire and Mike are mapping second and third layer of roof fall, as well as getting down into the articulation between the 2 rooms, which is an important part of understanding if this room is actually connected to the rooms that we've already opened. We try to get out here just after 8 every morning, and on good days when it's sunny and hasn't had rain, we uncover the dirt pile, which we cover every night in order to keep it from blowing away. So we uncover the dirt pile, we set up the screening stations, and then we uncover the areas that we're going to be working in. It dries very quickly, so we only uncover portions we are going to do. So we work in 1 by 1 meter units. We take photos at the start and end of every unit. It's really important when we go back to records and to artifacts to know where they came from and the context that they're in. And then they use mostly trowels and brushes to get artifacts in the structural wood, which they then collect in every unit. Archaeology is all about context, so the objects are important, but without context, we really don't have an idea of where they came from, what they're in relation to, or how we should be interpreting them. So that's why we have grid lines over everything, and each unit is its own grid where people measure things into. We use a total station to tie everything into the GPS coordinates of the site. And so we shoot all our artifacts as well as all our architectural wood in with the total station so that we can get a great map in GIS at the end of the season. Our photogrammetry is also linked to the GIS and the GPS, so you can put it right onto the exact spot on the landscape from aerial photos and maps. We take a couple breaks, lunch and afternoon and morning breaks. We work until about 5:30 and then we start to clean up. All the wood that's exposed gets covered. And we cover up the back dirt pile. And then we bring in all the artifacts and cultural materials we've collected that day into the lab. We don't get a very long season to dig when the ground isn't frozen, and it's expensive to get up and do all the logistics and get everybody into remote camps. So we work 6 days a week. We get Sunday off. If it rains, we have to go into the lab because we can't work and record in the rain. So that's what we did yesterday.
This house, feature 12, the one for which we're continuing the excavation this summer, turns out to be a really complex house, an architecture form different from the more usual house shape that has this long tunnel that enters into a main room. All these were in front, and then the floor planks were on top of this. I do maps, we take photos, those are two-dimensional representation. And so when you add the third dimension of photogrammetry to produce 3D images of the areas that we excavate, it really is extraordinary for archaeologists. And it's really interesting as a visual tool, but it's also a research tool.
From photos I'm doing, I can do 3D of the house. I have to take it from certain angles. Might need between 150 photo and maybe 200 photo. First do wide shot of the house, and later I will take close up the parts that have a lot of, for example, angles or that are very important for the model. Later with the software I can put them back together and have a 3D model. The good thing with 3D, it's not deformed like in photography. And I can put it in scale so people can measure on it, and you can also have vision from the above. So you don't need, for example, a drone to take photo from above.
That's the part that we excavated this year. So what we uncovered this year was this. And then this is the long tunnel, and so that's going to the next excavation area. No, this is nice. See? And you see the wall here. That is wonderful. I love it. It's very useful to be able to go back into the house, actually, and see it in its 3 dimensions. These different ways with which we record the site, they work together. Photogrammetry on its own would not be enough without the maps, because when I'm mapping, I'm able to see connections that you wouldn't see just with photos, because you have to really understand where the wood is going and how it's organized and which one is on top of which to be able to then understand the architecture and the construction. There is actually a connecting room, indeed, south tunnel, so it's going into a second room, but that room is actually twice as big as the first room that we had uncovered in 2011. 5-6 feet on each side, so it makes it for a very small and closed space. And there was no place to sleep there. The roof of the south room was really very complex. What we call now the east room is very complex as well. Large posts, large side walls, and larger than we expected, remarkably preserved thanks to the permafrost.
So Juliet's going to take out these logs, they've been mapped, so that we can dig under them. Wood that we're finding here is much less well preserved than the stuff we're finding over there. What we do see is just the upper layers are much more degraded. Sod growth and grass growth and things like that, which causes things to deteriorate. You'll see some of the logs she took out had roots growing through them, which you won't find deeper And we'll just lightly brush the surface, although the archaeologists have mentioned that the wood is what we call delaminating or sloughing off on the top layers.
Suzanne Grave-Rosen, she's a conservator and has been invaluable for the type of work she does. Yesterday when she extracted this very fragile artifact, all the way to packaging the material so that it can go back for analysis. That was a big part of the project too, actually, was having a conservator on site and in the lab help preserve the materials and stabilize everything and protect the artifacts.
There's a lot of different deterioration factors on a site that can affect how well an artifact is preserved. On archaeological sites, organic remains are not generally well preserved, but the Arctic is very unique in that organics are preserved in that permafrost layer, so they're cold and it's like a little time capsule. If you think about it, the artifacts have been stable for 1,000 years, and as soon as we excavate them, that exposes them to light and oxygen and moisture, things that they didn't have in their original environment. During the excavation, you'll probably notice that the sediments are very thick and can cover the objects and mask a lot of the details that are on the surface. So the archaeologists will package them very carefully and bring them to the laboratory where we can get a closer look at actually how the object is formed and shaped and how well it's preserved. So here we have a section of wood that was excavated yesterday, and the archaeologists have identified it as a kayak fragment. The surface of the wood is in really good condition, which is rare. Artifacts that are found on archaeological sites that are closer to the surface are generally in worse condition. Artifacts that are found deeper in the archaeological site are in better condition, and that's just because they aren't exposed to warmer temperatures. They're actually in the permafrost, which helps preserve them. In this area, we're largely seeing seal or caribou hide. They often would need several sections together. And in order to do that, they would have to join them with stitching, which could often be baleen or sinew or the tendon of the animal. The stitching doesn't preserve as well in the archaeological record, so we might just see the holes or the wear pattern of where the stitching was. This is a baleen bowl that was excavated in the field a few days ago. We collected the bowl as a block of soil and moved it onto a solid platform to investigate what's inside the bowl and how it was constructed. As a whale product is an organic material, and it's very soft and supple and very prone to damage. When baleen bowls are made, they actually have a wood base that's oval in shape, and they're soaked in water to allow them to absorb and swell. The baleen itself is also soaked in water. As it dries, it slowly kind of shrink wraps itself around the wood base. You can see there's a seam down the front here, and this is where they would have sewn or lashed together the baleen to connect it so that it overlapped. The baleen itself is very fragile and flexible. You can see we've used that same foam to insert a support on the inside, but we're also applying pressure from the outside. After the excavation season finishes, we go to a workshop in Shishmaref and share the finds with the local community. They really get to understand how the objects are perceived and how they're appreciated. Artifacts are made by other people, and so we're really interested in why did this person use the artifact or how did they create it? And that's important for us to understand as conservators when we're actually thinking about how to preserve it.
Sometimes they'll have a little opening at the end, but it closes there where the nerves probably go in.
Okay.
When I saw the archaeological site, it kind of gave me an insight as to how we could subsist in the hardships of, the lifestyle with what tools we had.
Each object has a story, even if it's a seal bone or part of a whale flipper or a sediment core. A sealing harpoon head might just tell us people were sealing. Obsidian is telling us where they're getting the material and how far their relationships extend. It's not just about the digging, it's about the interpretation that grows out of the digging.
The house is rich. It gives you this impression of plentifulness. Obviously no shortage of baleen, no shortage of ivory, no shortage of antler. There's a lot of caribou bones in the site, a lot of seals, of course. In the houses on Ridge 5, a proportion of seal is 95%, I think. Really the staple food is seal. The Feature 12, it's a bit more mixed.
Other than wood, bones are probably the most numerous artifact type that we get. Last year, when we went under the roof, there were more bones than soil. I take these broken bits of bones and I identify them to species, and from that identification I can start to look at things like patterns of subsistence, even seasonality, when were they getting certain animals, what age were those animals when they were getting them. Each individual bone won't tell you much, but as a whole they tell you quite a lot. Last year we were on the project and we excavated fully Feature 21, which is an early Thule house, and I analyzed the bones from that house, which were typical of coastal Arctic sites. They were about 85 to 90% seal, small seal, so this includes ring seal, spotted seal, and ribbon seal for this area, with a little bit of caribou, dog, fox, hare, and some birds. Very little fish. This site, however, from what I've seen coming out of the ground, in an occupation layer that seems to be connected, although maybe not directly with the occupation of the house, quite a few large dog or wolf bones. Things that look like dog but are very large, which could indicate wolf. So this is a kind of typical fox bone. And then this is the dog wolf bones we are getting, which are much larger. So the dogs they would have had at this time would have been like the huskies of today. Dogs and wolves would have interbred. And so you might be seeing part dog, part wolf. They're either breeding large dogs, or there are a ton of wolves on the landscape.
One of the questions we're asking is whether people were actually whaling here. People say that people were whaling here.
This so-called Bernert culture has always been the origin point for whalers up north, and I think it does hold that key place in Arctic prehistory as this major shift to a whaling economy. We're finding compelling evidence that they were certainly taking some very large sea mammals right in this area. So there is a story here that's almost unanticipated by archaeologists.
One of the whales that we have is this kind of small whale. This is a cervical vertebrae, which is kind of your top neck vertebrae. The larger whales that have fused epiphyses and are older are left out at the site. I do my analysis on them at the site because it is too heavy to carry back here, let alone to ship back to Kansas and then ship back to Alaska where the bones are held indefinitely. These are the vertebrae I'm talking about that wouldn't be traded and are difficult to imagine people carrying very long distances. Things that are typically found if people are scavenging whales or trading them are flipper bones. So this is a whale toe of a front or hind flipper. Flippers would have been easily cut off from a whale and then brought back to site. So this is more of a kind of typical bone that we find.
Shelby Anderson, she's a ceramic specialist, finding that the ceramic, the pottery that is found in Feature 12 is actually showing differences than maybe people coming from elsewhere. So that's one more element of the story, actually.
What's always been really interesting to me about Espenberg and actually the whole Seward Peninsula, but there are many decorative styles represented, which suggests a couple of things that I'm pursuing with additional analysis now, which is people who spent time at Espenberg traveled a lot across the whole region, or they could have had family connections across the whole region. So they're sharing information about pottery decorative styles. There are decorative styles that seem to be specific to the Seward Peninsula, and then there are ones that I find that I think come from northern Kotzebue Sound or from up the Kobuk River, and I think that's where they were made, and they're found in smaller quantities, but they are found at Espenberg. That site tends to have more different kinds of pottery styles. To me, that's indicative of complex and far-reaching social relationships. And then through several statistical analyses, we can begin to create pottery groups based on their geochemistry, and then we can relate them to actually geographic places based on where we know the ceramic came from, my data set that I now have for the whole region, and our knowledge of the local geology.
So we can test to see what they were.
Making pottery here is really hard. There's really a short window of time when people could have been actually firing the pots in the summertime, I think. That knowledge is very specific to this region. Pottery was definitely important enough that people were spending time away from other activities to make it.
Patrick Reed, Shelby student, is here taking care of the ceramic actually, and we will bring everything back to Shelby.
So we'll kind of gently scrape a lot of this off, trying to preserve what is actually touching it. The primary things that we're looking for that tell us a lot about the ceramics themselves are the size, the shape of the vessel itself, what the materials were being used to manufacture the pieces. We have this lovely body sherd here that has this curvilinear design on it. It's very subtle, but basically a pattern will be carved into a wood or bone paddle. And once the vessel was formed, they would take it and paddle this design around the outside. This piece has this very distinct lip. As you can see on this rim piece here, we actually sometimes get residues caked to the outside or even oftentimes on the inside. Those can be used to tell us what was being stored in them and what they were being specifically used for. The material, the clays that were used to produce these ceramics can tell us roughly about where they came from, or at least the clay sources themselves. Oftentimes, oil lamps would be made out of ceramics as well.
So there is the narration that we do as archaeologists, which is our profession, but it's one part of the story, and then there's the local story as well. And whether those two types of narration can meet themselves, or whether it's really two narrations that will never cross. And I hope there is a crossing, of course. But I think it's important to record the different perception of not only of what we do, but how we talk about what we do when we talk about this past.
Wanga Akadi, Kigitag Migu Junga. My name is Akadi. I'm from Shishmaref, Alaska, and I'm cutting up banaluk. Banaluk is a dried bearded seal. The blubber, we put it in buckets and hang the banaluk and let it dry. Mostly on Sundays. We try to embrace our heritage and, have family dinners. These are the crispies, blubber. This is a half dried. And these are all parts of the seal, the bearded seal. Usually when kids are babies in the village, we usually let them gnaw on the banaluk and let them get used to the taste of eating native foods. It's good for you. It has all these vitamins and nutrients that your body needs, and having that fat through the winter would be good for you. So we're gonna have all the French people try it, people from different parts of the world try it and see what they think. And I think it's really good that they get to know our culture and maybe respect it a little more from knowing the process and how we prepare it.
Is it stored in his own hole?
Sometimes it would depend on the time that we caught the seal, and we put it in the container to render. And then we take it out and divide it into gallon-sized containers.
The important part is also that we've had many students from Shishmaref who have come to participate, and also not just students, but also other individuals. Alexander Wewana, and then Ashton Nayakpak. And then there's 3 more people coming to help close the site. Last year we had Edgar Ningeluk and Denise Fernandez, who came as a student assistant to work. They're from Shishmaref.
This summer I came here in June, and then last summer I came here in July. I learned a lot there. It was pretty fun, and seeing what they used to use back then, it makes me just think about how smart they were. Tools I don't think I would ever think of making them. I think I would encourage people to go there and experience what I experienced and just learn.
And this summer we had 4 people coming as student assistants, and that was Nicole Nayakpak, Augustine Olana, Sylvia Nayakpak, and Okedi Nayakpak. And they've all been really important actually, and brought a lot of different energy to the project.
I came here to the excavation site to see how our culture changed through generations and to see how our native art and hunting skills and hunting tools have changed. So far it's been pretty good. I'm currently helping with the sod house, and we found plenty of artifacts that relate to our native arts.
My biggest hope actually would be that one of the youth or one of the person that came either to the workshop or came here to work with us would go on and become an archaeologist. We're interested in the narration of the past as well.
Hip bone, you know, go like this and that hip bone.
And how are those objects used to talk about the past?
Last summer I was
Amber Lincoln is the cultural anthropologist who is working with us on the project.
I'm interested in how people on the Seward Peninsula understand their history, tell that history to each other through material culture like old artifacts, art, tools that people use, as well as how that history is told, perhaps when people are traveling, through place names. As part of that, I have been coming to Shishmaref and interviewing people on their personal collections, the special things that people keep, things that are passed down to them, special tools such as ulus or scrapers that grandmothers pass to grandchildren, what those objects mean to them.
We don't sell artifacts. It's our ancestral, what they call beta. It belonged to them, and I feel very fortunate that I have all these artifacts to remind us of our heritage, because they were used by my ancestors. They were a necessary implement to survive at that time, and they were different than what we have now. This one is used for picking blueberries off branches.
So we definitely want to know how the Cape and Cape Espenberg and the Espenberg River were used in the more recent past and today. There are families who have history in that part, and so we were able to travel with Fred Goodhope Jr. and Elsie Barwayana. Dennis Sinnock took us out on a boat, and we traveled from Shishmaref to Cape Espenberg. And what was so great about that was to hear Fred and Dennis and Elsie too mention the different place names along the way and the different camps. So they pointed out, you know, whose camp was there and some of the history that came along with those camps and building different campsites or cabins.
One that's the farthest east belongs to my aunt Bessie Cross. That's the sister of Gideon Barr and my mother Fanny. The next shed is a warehouse. Then coming this way is Gideon Barr's cabin.
So long ago, built September 1947. I'm so happy I come over here, bring back so many memories. You could even see that old lamp down there. I just remember when my grandmother's house, we would go to her house and she'd be cooking donuts with seal oil.
And then when we got to the archaeologist site, the archaeologist took us out there and we just discussed, you know, different ideas, different stories come up. For instance, at the Whale Monument, Fred Goodhope was able to tell the story that he remembers associated with the Whale Monument.
There's probably different versions. My auntie Bessie Cross told me that story.
As a government agency, the National Park Service is required to do tribal consultation on projects with the tribe, but also we want to make sure that The researchers are engaged with that community. Having community involvement also gives the researchers a different point of view on a project. It creates a partnership with those communities. It lets people know what you're doing in the park. That really brings people together with that project.
The archaeologists were able to bring excavated material back to Shishmaref for 2 days, and we just lined the tables with paper, and they pulled out the artifacts and put them on the tables, and the community was able to come through. And this was a really great opportunity for knowledge exchange. The archaeologists could talk about the work that they've been doing, and local folks could come through and sort of discuss possibilities. It was a great exchange of knowledge, storytelling. What I really loved was when people brought their own collections in and showed us their historical artifacts, and we were able to have really nice exchanges about how they were obtained, where they came from, what they mean to people, asking people about special things in their personal collections. What strikes me is just how much pride people have in tools made by their ancestors. And when you look at an old harpoon head, or when you look at an ulu blade, those kinds of objects almost demand you to ask questions. People are really using that to talk about the past, and they're using it to sort of just think about innovation and the materials that people had to use. I just think it was an invaluable opportunity to learn from people who don't necessarily live together, people who live in Shishmaref and scientists from different parts of the world. By engaging in these workshops and coming back to Shishmaref with the excavated material and sharing information and stories, I know that we have all gained a better understanding of the heritage of this region, which is so rich.
We work with the National Park Service to ensure that the artifacts and the site is protected and accessible to researchers and to the community. The Park Service has several regulations that we follow and ensure that we're doing best practices to document the artifacts and to care for them. And one of those is to ensure that the artifacts are registered and that each detail about the object is carefully recorded, such as where it was found, what material type it's made out of, and any kind of preservation treatments that we apply to the object. So the Park Service provides permits to 3 organizations at this project. One is to the University of Kansas, where the faunal remains or the animal remains will be studied. Another is Portland State University, where the ceramic or clay artifacts will be analyzed. And the last is the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So all of these materials will go to one of those 3 institutions at the end of the research project. These objects will each be analyzed and studied for the type of material, the style, and that all helps us identify the time period and the culture that was using them. Once the artifacts are completed with being researched or analyzed, they'll go to the repository in Anchorage. So the Park Service has a curation facility which provides a stable environment that will protect these artifacts in perpetuity.
So it's not going to harm the artifact. Today we're here at the Alaska Regional Curatorial Center in Anchorage, Alaska. It's the repository for most of the national parks in Alaska for museum collections and archives. Now we're going to go into the 3D collection room for the Alaska Regional Curatorial Center. This is how we store some archaeological objects. We like to keep the temperature between 68 and 70 degrees and a relative humidity pretty low, about between 33 and 35%. So we keep things in boxes like this, anything that is in bulk. Faunal assemblages, bulk lithic assemblages, we are mandated to keep in perpetuity to preserve the history of these areas that are our national parks now. So these boxes right here are from the 2009 to 2011 excavations up at Cape Espenberg, and as you can see, there's some empty space here. So we're saving these spaces for when those researchers are finished doing their analysis and entering records into a database. We have space here. This is what we call the archives room, or the 2D room. And this is where all the paper records and photos, slides, negatives, all that stuff is stored. So here are archival records from Bering Land Bridge. All of the archaeological data field notes and reports and all that level forms, all those paper documents or associated documents will eventually be stored like this. They will be entered in the computer and stored in acid-free folders with titles, years, and then anyone can find it that needs it. If anyone has any questions about preserving any of their own photographs, negatives, artifacts, objects, or if they would like to come see all this stuff, it's free, open to the public, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. If you just look up National Park Service in Alaska Curators, or just call any national park in Alaska and ask for a curator's number, they can direct you to anyone here in Anchorage, and anyone can come see this whenever they're in Anchorage.
I think one thing I see at least is some public space in Shishmaref, Deering, Kotzebue that explains what we did, how we did it, how we reconstructed it, and what the meaning of it is both to academic and scholars and researchers as well as the communities.
One of the things I really appreciate about what they're doing in showing the artifacts is the fact that this is being done in transparency. We're being shown exactly what each item is instead of just taking the artifacts and putting them in museums.
We knew that we wouldn't be able to excavate this entire house, and to excavate the entire house would be incredibly interesting. It goes off to the southwest, it goes off to the north, and it goes off to the west itself, and it looks like it even goes off down into the south. But that would take more years of excavation, and to do the whole thing would be really, really interesting and really be able to flesh out some of the questions of who the Bernark were and who they were in relation to Thule.
I think it's a very important site for that. And to really understand the full extent of it, we would need at least one more season. It would be a shame not to be able to finish it. But to be able to finish it in the best condition, we have to keep up with the level of carefulness that we have started it with. So hopefully we'll be able to come back in the future.
Never really occurred to me until later on in life that I don't know if I belong there or not, but that's where I grew up. This land, I respect it.